The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Dr. Mara Solis was eating cold rice out of a container at her desk in the Deep Sky Array Operations Center in New Mexico when the alert tone sounded. A low, persistent chime she had programmed herself 5 years ago and had never once heard trigger for real. She set down her chopsticks with a care that seemed, in retrospect, almost ceremonial. Then she looked at her screen. The data was impossible. She said that word out loud, alone in the control room at 2:47 in the morning, her voice flat and clinical. Impossible. Then she pulled up the secondary feed, cross-referenced the array's calibration log, checked for atmospheric interference, and ran the signal through the anomaly filter 3 times. The result did not change. The pattern in the radio band was not natural. It was not instrument error. It was not a satellite bounce or a military test or a pulsar they hadn't cataloged yet. It was structured. Mara picked up her phone and called her supervisor, Dr. Johannes Tedes, answered on the 4th rung sounding groggy, and immediately not groggy at all. She told him what she had. He told her not to tell anyone else. She said she already hadn't. He said he'd be there in 20 minutes. He made it in 14. By morning, there were 7 people in the room. By the following morning, there were 41. And the U.S. Department of Defense had sent a general who kept asking questions that revealed how little he understood about radio astronomy. By the end of the week, the signal had been confirmed by observatories in Chile, South Africa, and Japan. By the end of the second week, it wasn't a secret anymore. It never really was. The object. They stopped calling it a signal when the trajectory data came in, when they understood it was not just a message but a source, a thing, physical artifact moving through space at a velocity that made interstellar travel not theoretical but historical fact. The object entered the solar system from above the ecliptic plane, moving at roughly 12% of the speed of light. It was decelerating. That was the part that kept Mara awake. Natural objects don't decelerate. Comets don't break. Rocks don't decide to slow down. Whatever this was, it had seen the sun and chosen to stop. She spent 3 days writing and rewriting the section of her report that described the object's behavior because every word she chose implied intent, and implication felt dangerous. She was a scientist. She dealt in what could be measured. When Johannes read the draft and looked up at her over his reading glasses and said, "Mara, it's slowing down on purpose," she found she couldn't argue. "I know," she said. "Then say it." She said it. The report went up through channels that most people don't know exist, and, within 72 hours, the Secretary General of the United Nations was on a secure line with 12 heads of state, and the 12 heads of state were all asking variations of the same question. What do we do? Nobody had a good answer. There were protocols. Technically, old documents drafted in the 1980s and revised periodically, sitting in institutional drawers, gathering the theoretical dust of a scenario nobody truly believed would ever be real. Mara had read them once years ago and thought them alternately grandiose and naively optimistic. They assumed humanity would have time. They assumed humanity would be unified. They assumed the encounter would unfold on a human timescale, with human courtesies between beats. The object did not cooperate with any of these assumptions. It decelerated for 9 days. In those 9 days, every radio telescope on Earth was pointed at it. Mara's team managed to resolve a shape from the radar returns, elongated, asymmetric, roughly 400 meters along its primary axis. Not enormous by geological standards, enormous by every other standard. The surface was not smooth. There were structures on it, geometric regularities that nature does not produce. On the morning of the 10th day, stopped, not slowed and coasted, stopped, 0 relative velocity, parked at 1.3 astronomical units from the sun, almost exactly on Earth's orbital path, leading Earth in its orbit by about 11 degrees. It sat there, and it did not move, broadcast nothing. And for 6 days, the world looked at it and tried to decide what that silence meant. Mara decided it meant they were waiting. She was right, but not in the way she expected. The secondary signal began on the 7th day of the object's stillness. It came not from the object but from Earth's own deep space communication network. The signal originated in the object, received by the array in New Mexico, and then rebroadcast, not by the array, not by any human hand or machine, by the object itself using Earth's own frequency bands. as if it had spent 6 days learning how to use them. The message was short, 47 seconds. It repeated on a 30-minute cycle. It took 11 hours to establish that the signal was not random. 4 more days to establish that it was not in any human language. It took 11 more days, a team of 17 linguists, 3 information theorists, and a mathematician named Dr. Petra Holm, who had written her doctoral thesis on non-anthropocentric communication, extract the first meaningful fragment. The fragment was 3 concepts which Petra rendered in English as we, observe, invitation. The world exploded. Mara remembered the exact moment the translation was released. Not to the public, not yet, to the expanded working group that had swelled to several hundred people across 12 countries. She was standing in the temporary operations center they'd established in a repurposed airport hangar outside Albuquerque, coffee going cold in her hand, watching Petra write the 3 words on a whiteboard. The room went very quiet. Then a man near the back, she never found out who he was, said quietly, "Invitation to what?" Nobody answered. Nobody could. The public had known about the object for 3 weeks by this point. The world had not ended. That surprised people. There had been panic in some cities during the first week. Runs on grocery stores. A string of apocalyptic protests. Markets that swung wildly before stabilizing. But humans are, Mara had always thought, stubbornly adaptive. They wake up the next morning. They drink their coffee. They read their news feeds and argue about what it means and make dinner and try to sleep. Life, specifically because it is the only thing people have, continues to be lived. What she hadn't expected was the anger. Not terror, though there was terror. Not wonder, though there was wonder too, a vast, uncoordinated global wonder that expressed itself in a million different ways. Art and music and prayer and equations, scrawled on napkins in every language on earth. What surprised her was the anger. Forums full of people furious that they had not been told sooner. Governments furious at other governments for releasing information too early or too late. Scientists furious at other scientists for how they were framing the data. A bloc of nations in the global south furious that the response was being coordinated primarily by institutions in North America and Europe was, Mara thought, an entirely fair point. All of it happening while something 400 meters long sat perfectly still 11 degrees, ahead of them in their own orbit and waited. The decision to respond was made not by any single government or body, but by a kind of exhausted consensus after 3 weeks of argument. There were factions that wanted silence. The object had said, invitation, and silence might be read as declination, which might be safe. There were factions that wanted a response but disagreed violently about what form it should take, who should craft it, what language, what content. There were factions that had already decided the object's presence was hostile and pushing hard, behind closed doors that Mara was not cleared to be behind, for options she didn't want to think about. Johannes told her about those conversations late one night, standing outside the hangar in the desert air, both of them looking up at a sky that now contained something that hadn't been there 2 months ago. Someone used the word preemptive, he said. Course they did. It's not completely irrational, Mara. It is, she said. We don't know what it is. We barely know what it said. You don't throw a punch at something you don't understand. You do, he said, if you're afraid. She didn't answer that. She understood the fear. She felt it herself, a constant low-grade hum, beneath everything the particular terror of smallness. Not personal smallness, but civilizational smallness. The recognition that whatever had built that artifact had solved problems humanity hadn't even fully articulated yet. Faster than light travel, or something close enough to it to make no practical difference. Directed deceleration across interstellar distances. Communication protocols adaptable to unknown receivers. These were not things you built by accident. The civilization that built that artifact was not young, and it was here. But she also kept returning to the word invitation. It was, she knew, a translation. A best-fit approximation of a concept rendered in an information structure she didn't fully understand, interpreted by a team of brilliant humans working at the edge of their competence. It could mean something slightly different, could mean something very different, but it didn't have to. She thought about the first explorers, not the ones at the textbooks, the famous ones with their grand gestures. She thought about the ones who made the first tentative, terrifying contact with peoples they had never seen before. The moments of pure uncertainty, where a word mispronounced or a gesture misread could mean everything. She thought about how rarely those moments went perfectly, and how often they went less badly than feared, and how the history of human contact was not only conquest and catastrophe but also trade, and language borrowed across boundaries, and music that crossed the ocean before the people who made it did. She thought, "We have done this before. We have stood at the edge of the known world and decided to step forward, not always wisely, not always well, but we stepped." Response was transmitted on a clear Tuesday morning, 67 days after the signal was first detected. It was a mathematical structure, prime number sequences, geometric progressions, basic physical constants, the closest thing to a universal language that Earth's best minds could construct. It was humble. It was, Mara thought, honest. It said, "We received you, we are here, we don't fully understand but we are trying." The object received it in 9 minutes and 42 seconds, which was the light travel time at 1.3 ASCII. It responded in 11 minutes and 3 seconds. The response was not 47 seconds this time. It was 4 hours and 17 minutes of dense, layered signal, and it would take the combined effort of every linguist, mathematician, and information theorist on the working group, 3 full weeks, to parse even the outer shell of its meaning. What they found inside, that outer shell stopped Mara's heart for one long second and then started it again at a different rhythm. The artifact was a record, not a weapon, not a probe in the intelligence-gathering sense, not a herald of invasion, a record. The civilization that had built it was gone. Their star had exhausted itself. Their world had gone with it, millions of years ago by Earth's reckoning. What they had sent was everything, a library, a message in a bottle, launched into the void with no specific recipient in mind on the theory, correct, as it turned out, that the universe eventually gives a message to someone who needs it. The 4 hours and 17 minutes of signal contained, compressed, layered form, the mathematics of their physics, the biology of their world, the history, as best as history can cross the gap between species and time, of a civilization that had risen, made all of its terrible mistakes, and then, in its final centuries, turned outward, not in conquest, in longing. They had wanted someone else to know they had existed. Shra showed Mara the section of the signal that corresponded to this. A recursive structure that, once you understood it, unmistakably elegiac, was grief rendered in mathematics. Mara sat down on the floor of the hangar and cried, not from fear, not from wonder, exactly. From recognition, she thought. We know exactly this. The desire to not be forgotten, the hope that after you're gone, something of what you were will persist in the world. Carved into stone, written in books, into the grooves of a vinyl record launched into interstellar space. We are the same funk kind of thing. Not the same, she was careful about that, even in her own thinking. Not the same biology, not the same history, not the same anything specific, but the same kind. Beings who looked at the dark and felt it looking back, and decided the answer to that darkness was to make something and send it forward. The working group debated for weeks what to call it. The artifact, the library, the archive. Some people insisted on the clinical distance of the object. Petra called it the message, always with the capital, and that eventually stuck in the broader team's informal usage. In Mara's notes, from the very beginning, she had called it something else. She had called it the companion. The decision about what to do with the message, how to respond, whether to attempt to receive the full transmission, what to release to the public and when, split the working group in ways that exposed every fault line in human civilization simultaneously. National interest against collective interest. Scientific openness against security concern. The voices of institutions that had always held power against the voices of everyone else, who had not been asked. Mara testified 3 times before bodies she was not permitted to name publicly. She said the same thing each time, and she said it plainly, because she had been raised by a woman who believed that plainness was a form of respect. She said, "Whatever knowledge is in that signal belongs to all of us. Not to a government, not to a military, not to a corporation, not to a scientific institution, including my own. The civilization that sent it is gone. The message is their inheritance to humanity, not to any subset of it. Every decision we make about how to receive it and share it will say more about us than about them. The third time she said this, in front of a body that had the authority to actually act on it, something shifted. She saw it in the room. A specific quality of silence that is different from ordinary silence. That means something has landed. 3 months after that testimony, the Global Archive Initiative was announced. An international consortium, unprecedented in its actual distribution of authority, tasked with the ongoing receipt, translation, and open publication of the message's contents, rotating leadership, drawn from every geographic region, with mandatory open-source publication of all findings within 12 months of extraction. It wasn't perfect. Nothing this messy and human could be. There were arguments about the rotation structure and fights about the publication timeline, and at least 2 serious political crises that threatened to collapse the whole framework before it fully formed. Mara was in the room for most of them, but it held. 14 months after the first signal, the working group, the archive team, now, managed to extract and translate the first complete section of the message's scientific content. It was a unified field theory, not a human unified field theory. Something else. Something broader, something that began where human physics ended and kept going. 2 of the physicists on the team wept when they read it, which Mara found both understandable and scientifically appropriate. She asked one of them, a physicist from Mumbai named Dr. Arjun Patel, who had barely slept in a week, what it felt like to read something like that. He thought for a moment, then said, "You know when you're trying to do a puzzle, and you've been working on it for years, and you have most of the pieces, but there are some that just refuse to fit. And you keep looking at the gap, and the gap doesn't resolve. And then someone hands you the missing piece. And it's so obvious, it fits so perfectly, and you feel both stupid for not seeing it and overwhelmed that you're seeing it now." He paused. "It's nothing like that. It's bigger. It's like being handed a different puzzle entirely that you didn't know existed, and looking at it and seeing that it connects your puzzle as a small corner and realizing the whole thing is solvable." Mara wrote that down. She wrote a lot of things down in the plain spiral notebook she had used since grad school because she had learned early that the most important data in any discovery is not the numbers, but the human response to the numbers. That was what would matter later. That was what would be studied. The companion remained at 1.3 HQUs. It did not advance. It did not retreat. It continued its transmission on a cycle, and as the archive team learned to receive more efficiently, as their translation software improved and their understanding of the message's information architecture deepened, the cycle grew richer. New layers revealed themselves. Sections that had appeared to be repetition turned out to be recursions. The same ideas at different resolutions, like zooming into a fractal and finding new detail at every level. It was designed to be understood incrementally, designed for a receiver who would start small and grow into it. That thought stayed with Mara for a long time. Whoever built this had imagined them, had imagined some receiver, somewhere, sometime, who would start at the beginning and work forward. Who would not have the context but would build it. Who would be, in some fundamental way, exactly what humanity was. Young, confused, brilliant in patches, prone to error, stubbornly persistent. They had built the message for someone like us. On the 2nd anniversary of detection, Mara gave a lecture at the University of Cape Town that was broadcast to something like 200 million people. She was not a public speaker by nature. She was a scientist. She liked data and quiet, and the particular satisfaction of a well-formed hypothesis that holds up under pressure. She had spent most of the previous 2 years in a hangar in New Mexico and a second facility in Geneva, doing work, not talking about it. But she had been asked, and she had thought about what she wanted to say for a long time, and when she stood at the lectern, she said it without notes. Because she had been saying it to herself for 2 years and knew it by heart, she said, "We spent the first weeks afraid. That's honest. We were afraid because something vast and unknown had appeared in our sky, and we didn't know what it wanted. And we are a species that has survived by being suspicious of the unknown. That suspicion served our ancestors. It was encoded in us over a very long time. But we also survived by doing something else, by looking at the unknown and asking what it was, by sitting with uncertainty long enough to let it become knowledge, by building tools to see farther and instruments to hear deeper and languages, share what we found. Every scientist in this room and watching this broadcast is the direct descendant of that impulse. The refusal to let fear be the last word. The civilization that sent us the message was afraid too. We know this, not because they said so directly, but because their history, as we've begun to reconstruct it, shows the same patterns ours does. The wars, the retreats, the periods of collective blindness. They made mistakes that cost them terribly. They learned. Slowly, and not always completely, but they learned. And in their final centuries, when they knew their star was failing, they didn't spend those centuries on themselves. They spent them on this, on the message, on the hope that somewhere, sometime, someone would find it and know, you are not alone in having existed. You are not alone in having wondered. The fact that someone is capable of asking these questions means you are, in some essential way, kin. We receive that message. We are the answer to someone's hope. I think that comes with a responsibility. She stopped there and didn't try to define the responsibility. She thought people could do that for themselves. She thought, in fact, that humanity doing that for itself, arguing and disagreeing and arriving at something imperfect but real, was more important than any answer she could provide. The applause, when it came, the kind that begins slowly and builds into something that surprises the audience with its own force. She stood at the lectern and breathed and did not cry, which she considered a personal achievement. After the lecture, she took a walk alone through the university's botanical garden, which was in bloom because it was austral spring, the flowers extravagant in the particular way of South African gardens, not delicate, but bold colors so saturated they seemed lit from within. She had her notebook with her. She sat on a bench and wrote for a while, not about the message or the companion or the archive initiative, but about the garden. Because she was a scientist and scientists observe, and there was something here worth observing. A species of bird she didn't recognize landed on a branch near her, examined her with one round eye, and departed. The flowers moved in the light wind off the mountain. The sun was warm on the back of her neck. Somewhere out there, at 1.3 astronomical units, something extraordinary was waiting patiently, broadcasting everything it knew on a cycle, addressing itself to the student it had never met and had spent 1,000,000 years preparing for. She wrote, "We are not alone. Not anymore. Maybe not ever." Then she crossed out the "not ever," because it was too neat, too resolved, and she didn't trust neat resolutions. She wrote instead, "Maybe never as alone as we thought." That she left. The Archive Initiative's first decade was the most turbulent and also the most productive period in the history of human science. Every field changed. The changes came in waves. First, physics, as Arjun's team worked through the companion's foundational sciences, and then biology, as the Medical Research Consortium extracted the sections of the message that dealt with biochemistry, and began the agonizing, painstaking work of translating the biology of a long-extinct alien species into terms that could speak to human medicine. Then engineering. Then, more slowly, more carefully, the sections that appeared to deal with what could only be called social architecture, the ways the builders had structured their civilization in their final centuries. When they had turned from consuming their world to tending it, those sections were the most contested. They were also, Mara thought, the most important, because the builders hadn't always been the civilization that sent the message. They had been, for a very long time, something much more like humanity was now. Fractious, extractive, brilliant, and brutal in alternating bursts. The history sections of the message, as the archive team painstakingly reconstructed them, read like a mirror tilted at a slight angle, familiar enough to recognize, different enough to be instructive. They had, several times, come close to ending themselves. The archive team identified at least 4 distinct near-collapse events in the builder's history, encoded in what amounted to a historical record, written with the explicitness of someone who needed the reader to understand. We almost didn't make it. We want you to know that. We want you to know that almost is not the same as didn't. Mara spent a month on those sections. She read them over and over, sitting in the Geneva facility with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, and she thought about what it meant to leave a record of your failures. Not your triumphs, your failures. The things you almost didn't survive, she thought. They trusted us enough to tell us where they went wrong. The responsibility of that felt enormous. It also felt, in a strange way, like a gift. Not the gift of their science or their technology, or their accumulated knowledge of the physical universe, though all of that was extraordinary, the gift of their honesty. The decision, made by someone or many someones in the last centuries of a dying civilization, to include not only the achievements but the stumbles, to say, here is what we were, all of it, the full account. On the 15th anniversary of detection, the companion began to move, not toward Earth, not away, reoriented. A slow, precise rotation that took 11 days, and when it had finished, its primary axis was no longer pointed at the sun, but at a point 37 degrees off the galactic plane, toward a region of space that Mara's team identified, after 3 weeks of work, as the approximate direction of a star system 43 light-years distant. The transmission pattern changed. The cycle that had repeated for 15 years shifted. New content appeared, denser, more compressed than anything they had previously received, structured differently. The archive team scrambled. Petra, who was 58 now and had not slowed down, called Mara from Geneva at 3 in the morning, with a voice that sounded like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. "Mara," she said, "I think it's saying goodbye." Mara sat up in her dark apartment in Albuquerque and pressed her phone against her ear and said nothing for a moment. "It's not leaving," Petra said. "I don't think it's leaving. But the new section, the compressed part, I think it's a summary. I think it's condensed everything we haven't received yet into a form we can decode with what we already know. Like leaving the answers written on the back of the test before the teacher walks out of the room." "They're giving us the rest," Mara said. "They're giving us the rest." Mara looked out her window. The Sandia Mountains were a black shape against a sky brilliant with stars, and she thought about distance. The 43 light-years toward which the companion had pointed itself ever was there, or had been there, or would someday be there. She thought about a civilization at the end of itself, calculating trajectories, doing the math on where this object might wander over a timescale of millions of years, deciding, send it toward the younger suns, or the places where the conditions are right, toward the next ones. They had planned for this, not this specifically, not humanity, not Earth, but they had planned for the fact of a next one. They had built the companion to find it, and it had. The companion remained reoriented for 3 months. Transmitting the compressed final section, Mara's team and the extended archive network worked in rotating shifts around the clock and around the globe, receiving, storing, beginning the work of unpacking. When the transmission ended, when the last of the compressed signal had been sent, and the companion went quiet for, first time in 15 years, Mara was in the operations center in New Mexico, the same room where she had eaten cold rice out of a container at 2:47 in the morning, and heard a chime she'd programmed and never expected to hear. The silence lasted 6 minutes. Then the companion resumed its original transmission cycle. The 47 seconds repeated every 30 minutes that it had been broadcasting since the beginning. We, observe, invitation. The first 3 words, the opening. Mara understood then what it was doing, had always been doing. The companion was not only a library, it was a letter. And like all letters, it had an opening and a closing, and between them it had said everything it needed to say. Now it was saying the opening again, endlessly, because it was also an address. Addressed to the next receiver, somewhere in the 43 light-year direction, who had not yet found it, whose radio telescopes had not yet been sensitive enough, or whose civilization had not yet emerged, who existed only in the statistical probability that life, given time, tends to arise. It was carrying the message forward. Mara sat at her desk in the quiet room and thought about continuity, about chains of knowing that reach through time and space from mind to mind, across the silence of the void. The builders had received something once, maybe, some hint, some fragment, or perhaps they had not and had built from nothing, and either way they had arrived, eventually, at the understanding that the knowledge one civilization holds should not die with it. They had built a machine to prevent that death, and now the machine sat in the neighborhood of a small yellow star, in a solar system with one inhabited planet, and that planet's inhabitants had received what it carried and were in the process of deciding what to do with it. The Archive Initiative, the Global Commons Treaty on Extraterrestrial Knowledge, which after 4 years of negotiation had finally been ratified by enough nations to be binding. The open-source repositories that now held terabytes of translated material, freely accessible with mirror servers on 6 continents. Not perfect, not fast, not without the fights and failures that attended anything humanity attempted at scale. But the knowledge was moving, being shared, being argued over, being incorporated into the work of researchers who had been born in the year of detection and were now studying for degrees. Being translated into 400 languages by volunteer networks Mara could not entirely keep track of. Being turned into textbooks, into art, into something a teenager in Lagos or Chittagong or Oslo or Lima would encounter in school and carry forward into the future. The chain was lengthening. Johannes retired the year after the Companion's final transmission. He came by Mara's office to say goodbye, which surprised her because he had never been sentimental about such things in all the years she'd known him. He stood in the doorway with his coat already on, as if staying too long would be a concession to feeling, and he said, "You did good work, Mara." "We all did," she said. "No." He shook his head gently. "I mean the specific work you did, the testimony, the lecture, the insisting that it belonged to everyone." He paused. "The science would have been done regardless. Science tends to get done. The other part, that could have gone differently. It nearly did." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said, "I just said what I thought." "Most people don't," he said, and left. She thought about that for a long time, thought about all the points along those 15 years where something could have broken wrong, where fear could have won, where military preemption could have triggered something they wouldn't have recovered from, where the pressure to hold the knowledge as property, as weapon, as advantage, could have fractured the Archive Initiative before it fully formed. The near misses were real. She knew that better than most people. But the thing about near misses is that you miss. And humanity, in those 15 years, had missed them. Not gracefully, not by any margin that permitted complacency, but they had missed them. They had looked at the unknown and decided, collectively if barely, that the right response to the unknown was curiosity rather than destruction, openness rather than hoarding, continuity rather than possession. They had been, when it counted, the kind of people the builders had hoped to find. She sat at her desk late on a winter evening, the mountains dark outside her window, and she opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote the date. She wrote the coordinates of the Companion, updated for its current position, because it was still out there, still broadcasting, still addressing the next receiver in a direction she would never be able to see from her window. She thought about what she would put in a message, if she could. If humanity had learned enough to compress its own library into something the Companion could carry forward. What would you say to a receiver you would never meet? What would you want them to know? She wrote for a while. Science. The science was already in the repositories, being refined by people far more qualified than she was. She wrote about the morning the signal had come in, the cold rice, the chime, the feeling of sitting in a quiet room at 2:47 a.m., and understanding that the universe had just handed you something that would change everything. She wrote about fear and how it had been there from the first moment, woven through everything, never entirely absent. She wrote about looking out at the night sky from the desert and feeling very small, and how that smallness was not the same as insignificance, and how long it had taken her to understand the difference. She wrote about Johannes and Petra and Arjun and the hundreds of others who had come to that hangar and given years of their lives to the slow, painstaking work of understanding something that had never been understood before. She wrote about the arguments and the failures and the times they had almost broken apart over competing interests and competing fears. She wrote about the times they had not broken apart. She wrote, "We are the kind of creature that makes mistakes and keeps going. That gets afraid and does the thing anyway. That argues about everything and cannot agree on almost anything and still, somehow, manages to build something together when the moment is large enough to demand it. We are infuriating and extraordinary, and we lose people we love, and we make the same errors repeatedly, and we dream of things that seem impossible, and then make them possible, slowly, badly, partially, and then a little better. She wrote, "If you're reading this, then you found the companion too. Then you received what the builders left, and you're trying to understand it, and you are probably afraid, and you are probably arguing, seer, and you are probably sitting in some equivalent of a hangar in the middle of the night wondering what comes next." She wrote, "Comes next is the work. It is always the work. You receive, you translate, you share, you build, and you pass it forward to whatever comes after you. That is what they trusted us to do, and we are trying to be worthy of it, imperfectly and stubbornly and persistently, which is the only way we know how to do anything." She stopped writing. The room was very quiet. Outside, the desert was cold and clear, and the stars were out in their millions, and somewhere among them, moving now on its new heading, Companion was still broadcasting. "We observe. Invitation." She closed her notebook. She picked up the cold cup of tea on her desk and drank it anyway. Then she opened her laptop and got back to work.